Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to begin this year's Future of Global Governance series with a novel theory on Transdisciplinary Systems Research, TSR, developed for my forthcoming publication with the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, UNITAR, Closing the Compliance Gap, System-Wide Transformation Methods for the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. I've been told to keep this friendly, so you'll find a picture of my puppy Frederick at the top of each slide. The contents of today's slides are also on our website together with my conference paper at unbuiltlabs.com/a theory on TSR. My goal today is to provide a high-level overview of the theory on TSR with a focus on ontological and epistemological considerations, so you can begin thinking about how you might apply TSR to your work. There are three parts to today's presentation. Part one, I'll begin on the right-hand side of the diagram, the concepts column, starting with defining transdisciplinary research, TDR, and systems research, so we can quickly arrive at a definition of TSR. Part two, I will talk about the top left-hand corner of the diagram, how different types of systems thinking led to transdisciplinary systems thinking, TST. Part three, I will focus on the middle of the diagram on ontology, defining a project's boundary if we depart from disciplinary boundaries, and epistemology, reconciling academic and non-academic ways of knowing. With limited time today, systems concepts with an asterisk have been explained in an earlier paper. Axiology and evaluation methods are only in the conference paper. You'll see a diamond where there's literature I'm unable to cover in depth. These are elaborated in the conference paper. First, what is TDR? In 2001, Schultz and Marx observed universities have departments, the real world has problems. In 2020, Schultz remarked, transdisciplinarity aspires to make the change from research for society to research with society. To be more precise, TDR has 5 components. It is when researchers work jointly with non-academic stakeholders across disciplinary boundaries towards a problem-solving, common good-oriented, mutual learning, and comprehensive approach to complex sustainable development problems. Systems research is when researchers apply systems thinking to research or conduct generalizable research into the nature of complex adaptive systems, such as their properties. Opting for the first definition of systems research, TSR is when transdisciplinary systems thinking, TST, is applied to research. TST has been formulated to solve grand challenges, such as the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, by combining TDR and common elements of contemporary systems thinking, with a dedicated research philosophy, including a theory on boundaries, ontology, procedures for examining evidence, epistemology, and valuation lenses, axiology. TSI are outputs of TSR, which can include recommendations, interventions, and other actions. This slide presents a summary of the critiques and developments of contemporary systems thinking and focuses on their ability to solve grand challenges. It is vital to acknowledge the value of different approaches. Despite the critiques, each of the approaches has and continues to contribute towards our understanding of systems. Hard systems thinking, HST, or the functionalist approach, refers to an approach which often takes a positivist position. Empirical observations of a system will reveal law-like determinants of system behavior, or structuralist view. Underlying structures determine systems behavior. In 1989, Rosenhead raised the concern that HST researchers' opaque mathematical techniques lead to exclusion, both by the analyst when they see themselves as the expert of the problem space, and of the analyst because of the process's opacity. Additionally, he argued that this paradigm has a tendency to treat people as passive objects. Soft systems thinking, SST, or the interpretive approach, incorporates developments in the social sciences to emphasize the social construction of reality and uses dialogue as a starting point for explorations towards accommodating competing interests. In 1991, Jackson argued that SST takes free and open discussion among stakeholders for granted without considering the complexity and time it takes to plan such a discussion. He also found that historically underrepresented people and communities are disadvantaged in public forums. As a result, power can shape which views and values are prioritized. In circumstances where there are irreconcilable differences among stakeholders, SST methods are neutral to the extent they are unable to provide guidance for action. Critical systems thinking, CST, examines contradictions, conflicts, and power in social systems to support systems change, with an emphasis towards the practical outcomes of knowledge processes and providing actionable guidance. In 2020, Rajagopalan argued that CST is strongly rooted in rationalism and does not sufficiently include non-academic stakeholders in the process of knowledge production. Moving on to part 3, ontology is the philosophical study of being in general, or of what applies neutrally to everything that is real. A theory of boundaries is critical to TSR. If we transcend disciplinary boundaries, what exists within the scope of our study? The ontology of TSR largely follows the philosophy articulated by York in 2011, from new thinking in complexity for the social sciences and humanities, a generative transdisciplinary approach. The first series of concepts is a complex reality, which describes the transdisciplinary, nonlinear, self-organizing, dynamically interdependent, fluid-like, ever-evolving nature of reality as a potential outcome of complex processes and generative mechanisms. To clarify, a fluid reality describes a shift from being to becoming, where reality no longer unfolds in stages, but one that is in transition and in the process of transformation. Generative mechanisms describe the creation of ideas. It posits that actors within complex systems are capable of composing original thoughts and actions, which can be seen as emergent behavior in a nonlinear process. Subsequently, actors have some agency and power to act in a way that is not prescribed by the overarching system. Boundary 1 is a complex reality. We assume reality is as defined earlier, and the subject of study exists as described by the definitions and properties of complex adaptive systems, grand challenges, and systems thinking. These assumptions are inherent within the definition of TSR. The second series of concepts critical to the ontology of TSR is the idea of boundary from critical systems thinking, which can be traced back to Churchman in 1970. Boundaries determine what issues exist, how issues are seen, and what actions will be taken. In 2000, Migley pointed out that since it is impossible for any analysis to be fully comprehensive as a result of a complex reality, it is necessary for researchers to make boundary judgments. A third series of concepts crucial to TSR is complementarism. Introduced by Flood and Jackson in 1991, complementarism posits that unlike pluralism, which suggests the presence or coexistence of different ways of being, a synthesis of different ways of being is possible. It enables us to move from a binary view, such as reductionism or holism, towards a transdisciplinary view of reductionism and holism for problem solving. Recall the expression, it is both a science and an art. Researchers can use boundary critiques from CST to identify further boundaries, but I articulate a second one, which is international law. TSR operates in accordance with international law, including international human rights law. TSR considers international law as an imperfect but practical reflection of global values, norms, and sentiments. Finally, onto my last slide. Transdisciplinary Systems Research, TSR, largely follows the epistemology of transdisciplinary research. Transdisciplinary systems research supplements the science-based treatment on uncertainty with concepts from the modern law of evidence and future studies to offer guidance on reconciling academic and non-academic ways of knowing. I would highlight two underlying concepts. First, internal and external credibility, a concept from action research. Greenwood and Levin in 1998 argued that action research distinguishes between internal credibility, i.e. knowledge is convincing to the stakeholder group generating it, and external credibility, i.e. knowledge is convincing to people who are outside of the stakeholder group generating it. Members of the communities are organizations that are unlikely to accept as credible the objective theory of outsiders if they cannot recognize the connection to the local situation. Action research argues that only knowledge generated and tested in practice is credible. TSR emphasizes the knowledge generated and tested in practice is valuable. Second concept that I would like to highlight is being mindful of epistemic hegemony. It is a term that is typically used to describe the lack of receptivity of non-Western scholars in epistemologies. Epistemic hegemony also extends to the sharp divide between generalizable and local knowledge, academic and practitioners, theoretical and applied subjects, etc., when we consider what constitutes valid knowledge and what level of rigor is necessary within this broader knowledge industry and knowledge enterprise. I will not elaborate on treatment on uncertainty today, but it will be interesting to highlight concepts from the modern law of evidence and future studies. The law of evidence is the body of law and discretion regulating the means by which facts may be proved in both courts of law and tribunals and arbitrations in which the structure rule of evidence apply. The modern law of evidence operates in an environment where aspirations to the ascertainment of the truth has to be balanced with the need for a decision, even if the evidence is inadequate or inconclusive. This is a more accurate portrayal of the context researchers work within a complex reality and takes into account properties of wicked problems. It introduces crucial concepts such as types of evidence, principles to justify the exclusion of evidence obtained illegally or unfairly, and different standards of proof. Given the ontological underpinnings of TSR, it is vital to acknowledge the uncertainty of knowledge. This changes conventional epistemology into an epistemology of the possible with greater awareness of the role of the future in our knowledge. In 2003, Angelica identified mismatches between theoretical truth, explanation, and predictive success, prediction. Predictions are evidential rather than demonstrative, i.e., we cannot deduce or prove a theory about the future through formal logic alone. Claims to knowledge are made by synthesizing evidence to argue for a predictive thesis, and therefore the epistemology of future studies depend not only on formal logic, but also on a larger theory of argumentation. The evidential nature of predictive argumentation reinforces the importance of concepts in the modern law of evidence. That's it for me for today. I hope these ideas will inspire impactful new lines of inquiry in your research for the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Thank you.
Marvin, thank you very much. What an interesting set of problems you've put forward and ideas. Does anybody have any questions for Marvin? Maybe we need to have an icebreaker here. So I'm quite familiar with Marvin's work, but I will. Would you like to talk a little bit more about the idea of the boundaries and how these ideas are formulated in that? How do we establish those boundaries in the first place?
There's this really great theory called critical systems heuristics from critical systems thinking. And the idea of boundaries in our research really comes into play because when we take out disciplinary boundaries, it really means that we're in this very vast problem space. And unless we define boundaries, which is what problems matter, what problems we consider pertinent to our research, we are unable to understand whether or not we have actually understood the problem at hand. And so that is where I would think the idea of boundary really comes into play.
Yes, and then you were talking, I'm thinking slide, let me move down, one of the last slides, about how stakeholders, internal and external stakeholders, which I would think would be another aspect of organizing what the problems are. Yeah, there we are. Mindful of epistemic hegemony, which I thought was an extremely interesting and problem in this area. You want to talk about that just a little bit more?
Yes. So one of the things that I think about a lot as a researcher is, and having worked with a lot of different organizations from the private sector, public sector to international organizations, is the idea of credibility. When do we consider the information we have at hand to be credible? And oftentimes in researchers' communities, there is a high degree of internal credibility, but when it is taken out of the field that the researcher is engaging with, there are incidents where people, for example, local populations will come in and question whether or not the research applies to their local context. I tend to find that there's also this idea that, okay, well, researchers who aren't in academia to be less rigorous or less credible, but in fact, there is actually a very high degree of external credibility that is required when research is being conducted at international organizations, for example, or when you are conducting research in the private sector. You need a lot of external credibility to gain buy-in from people who are not within your field. And so there's this idea of when is research successful, or how do you know the information that you have is valid? And that really goes to the heart of the idea of internal and external credibility.
You think that this is a bigger problem in the private sector, gaining trust?
I would say that with the private sector, obviously, the problem isn't necessarily external credibility in the epistemic sense, but the conflict of interest that is inherent in the research that is conducted by the private sector. So there is, and one of the things that I really am trying to push for is actually to get more private sector organizations to conduct transdisciplinary research where they engage actively non-academic stakeholders as well as communities in their research and in understanding how their operations are impacting communities. And I would think that in those areas where perhaps it doesn't meet the standard of proof required of academia, but it's still valuable, is really where, for example, here I wrote concepts from the modern model of evidence is incredibly helpful.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is something we're going to be coming back to as we go through the conference.